Hello, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. Welcome to VUX World. Today's episode is going to be an immense episode. It's going to be completely different to anything we've covered before. We've done a lot of things in the smart speaker space, and we've done a lot of things around development and a few things around design and stuff like that. But what we haven't done yet is taken the whole concept of voice and transferred that into either the mobile space or the web browser space. And that's exactly what we're going to do today, as well as cover plenty of stuff for all of you UX designers out there, graphical UX designers out there, who are thinking about considering moving over to the VUX, voice user experience design space. We have an extremely special guest joining us today. He is Brian Colcord of Voysis. He is the VP of Design at Voysis. We're going to find out all about Voysis, what the platform is, what it does, what Brian does and what his role is all about, and how he made the transition from graphical user experience designer over to the voice world, and how you can do the same too. Hello there, Brian.
Hey guys, how are you doing?
Very, very well. Thank you very, very much for joining me. Voysis looks like an immense platform and company as well. Let's have a chat about yourself first, Brian. Let's kind of discuss your sort of background, and can you tell the listeners of VUX World a little bit about yourself and your background and what you do at Voysis?
Certainly. I've been fortunate. My career has really spanned a broad change in technology. So I basically went to college, and there was America Online with dial-up internet. And then I graduated college 4 years later, and there was high-speed internet and the internet as we know it today. And so I kind of graduated into this .com space, and you know what, over the past kind of 20 years, I feel like technology has grown in leaps and bounds. So it's been really an interesting journey for myself as a designer and an illustration major when I started in school, and kind of coming into the design world and playing the role of almost every designer type in the book, I would say, over the past 20 or so years. Over time, I started my own business. I had my own company for a while, and I taught myself a lot of things, and I've always been a tinkerer. So it's that kind of felt right for me. And I kind of was self-taught and kind of had to learn on the fly, so to speak. So I think that experience was really great as I kind of moved more into the corporate world, where I really kind of became a much more of a focused product designer at LogMeIn, my previous job, where I was at for about 6 years. And that's really where I learned about, building products, and the mobile space really blew up during that time frame. And I really kind of built my UX chops there. And now I'm on to Voysis, which is a whole new chapter, I guess you could say.
Wicked. So you started out then kind of when you were sort of going through the education stuff, doing actual illustrating, as in sort of drawings and illustrating in that respect?
Yeah, it was interesting back then because I was really starting to push the boundaries there with technology. This was back when, Photoshop 2 was out, I think. And, I was illustrating on a Mac using a stylus. Which was something that was completely foreign to most of my instructors. I took a class on it, and that was kind of my first introduction to, kind of working on the computer. And I got really interested in design my freshman year, taking those foundational courses, and it was something that really stuck with me. And, I kind of realized early on that it was going to be the more commercial success for me, where I'd be able to make money doing it and make a living, as opposed to being an illustrator. So it was a good choice to move the way I did.
Cool. And then LogMeIn, that's a really successful company. That's the company behind Join Me, isn't it? Is that right?
Correct. Yep. So ironically, I started by designing the first iteration of Join Me when I had my own company. I had done the brand mark and the first versions of the interface for that product itself, and then I kind of moved on to working at LogMeIn. And yeah, I think that was it was another really interesting kind of time time frame from, like 2010 to kind of 2006-7, where, mobile, I think the iPhone 3 was still out when I first went there, and mobile was kind of this like novelty when I got there. And obviously when I left, it was a huge thing with, the explosion of apps and mobile phones and the power that those had. So yeah, it was a good time frame to kind of be in a place that was a very innovative culture and really took risks on things. It was still kind of a startup-y vibe, and so it was a good experience there to kind of cut my teeth.
Wicked. And you had some experience designing in all kinds of areas, and one of those was for the Apple Watch as well. You want to tell us a little bit about how all that come about and what it was that you were working on?
Yeah, so we I forget exactly how it played out, but we were kind of a preferred partner or something like that with Apple. And when the watch was about to launch, they asked some companies to kind of come up conceptually with some ideas for how they might utilize the watch itself. And so it was one of these things where this was kind of just put on our plate, and we kind of were tasked with figuring out what the best route to take was. And I kind of look at it as it was just another kind of pivot in technology and user interactions. These wearables were starting to pop up here and there. And, this was kind of the first foray into actually kind of mass interaction on your wrist. I mean, you had like Fitbits and things like that, but there was no really. So I think what was really interesting about it was, that there wasn't really any patterns or anything to follow or to research to kind of understand, the mental model of the user and how users might utilize the watch itself. And the fact that it wasn't available to play with was just kind of a dark hole, so to speak. There wasn't any kind of understanding about how it worked or what it was capable of doing. So, a lot of the early concepts were, just basically taking your app and like reincarnating it on this screen that was, a 16th of the size. And as we kind of worked on it, we quickly started to figure out that it became fairly obvious that, finding that core interaction, that one thing that your app does really well, or that the watch itself could help to enhance, was really the feature to focus on with the watch, and keeping it really simple. And I think a lot of the kind of the watch apps that are out there now that are useful and successful, really kind of nailed that single thing that makes it work in that form factor.
It sounds like already there's some sort of similarities in there then, in terms of, obviously you've got sort of experience in kind of dealing with and figuring out emerging platforms, and some of the things you mentioned there seem applicable in the voice space as well, in terms of, I know you've written about the fact that there isn't necessarily design patterns like the excuse me, like the burger menu, for example, which is now a kind of commonplace thing. There's no real similar things for voice. And then also another problem is where people and brands may well be trying to just, as you to use your words, reincarnate the app experience in the sort of voice space. So it seems as though the same kind of stuff is kind of happening. Is that what you're finding with Voysis and moving into the voice space?
Yeah, I think definitely. And I think you kind of see that with all technology shifts. I think, you saw it from, in the late 90s when you went from print to online. Like basically it was just, websites were basically brochures that were online that were kind of indexing content, like a table of contents. And then when the mobile kind of evolution came along, you saw people trying to adapt, again, more brochure-y things and trying to figure out how their brand kind of fit in the mobile space. And then the watch, and then like you said, voice, I think, is the next, for us, from our perspective, it's the next kind of challenge that we're all faced with as designers, to figure out how to solve that. And I think the people that are or the companies that do figure it out are the companies that are going to be the ones that are, like you said, making, adapting their, what their brand promises and what they're going out to the market with, and adapting it to interesting ways to interact with that brand, not necessarily the same ways that we do with traditional touch or point and click interfaces.
And one of them companies obviously helping brands to sort of do that is Voysis. Do you want to tell people out there who may not be familiar with Voysis a little bit about what Voysis is?
Yeah, sure. So we're a Dublin-based voice technology company. We've got offices in Boston and Edinburgh also. I'm in the Boston office. And, we really believe that all interactions with technology can be as natural and as efficient as human ones. And, in that vein, what we're really trying to do is bring or give any business the ability to create their own brand-specific natural language voice experience. We really want to kind of bring that passion for, natural interactions with technology to the companies that we work with.
Mm-hmm. So if let's say, for example, a brand is looking to kind of figure out how Voysis might be able to help them, then what are some of the things that Voysis do as a company that will enable a brand to do that and to help brands out in that kind of respect? You've been focusing heavily in the e-commerce kind of sector at the moment, haven't you?
Sure. Yeah. E-com was kind of the first, I guess, we're a general platform, but, e-com was kind of the first productized, quote unquote, vertical that we wanted to play in. We thought there was a lot of opportunity there. But I mean, simply put, basically what we do is we combine your data with our platform. The platform is obviously powered by our proprietary voice technologies. Like we have our own ASR, our own NLU, our own deep learning engine, our own text to speech. So we combine your data. So for instance, with an e-com company, that might be your product catalog and our platform together to essentially build an intelligent voice, artificial intelligence. And then that deeply really understands the specifics of your products, services, vocabulary, because we've basically ingested your product catalog. And then it becomes accessible via a number of ways. You can use an API. You can use a JavaScript library. We have SDKs for both Android and iOS. So that's kind of how it works. But as an example, imagine if you're like a footwear company selling sneakers online or something like that, or selling shoes online, and you want your customers to be able to shop for shoes on your website using voice. So our solution for commerce allows users to search, refine, buy products, all using their voice and using natural language to do so. So if you think of a current kind of mobile experience in for a retailer, there's a lot of kind of drilling in. Like if you're looking for a specific pair of shoes or a specific type of shoe, there's a lot of either tapping and drilling or searching and filtering, searching and sorting, all that stuff. And our voice layer basically can bypass all of that. So you can ask for very simple things like show me men's running sneakers, or you can ask for very complex things. You could say, show me the latest Air Maxes from Nike in size 14 that are under $130, for instance. So you can essentially do a lot of that stuff that you're doing in a graphical interface that's taking you multiple taps and multiple interactions to do in kind of one step. So really what it is it's increasing the efficiency, increasing the the time to finding what you're looking for, and then ultimately hopefully increasing decreasing the time to cart. So you're working faster through that process. So that's kind of how we're focusing on retail, but as a broader picture, we're also trying to play in other spaces as well. It's not just an e-commerce solution. It can, we've dabbled in the entertainment world, and healthcare and stuff like that. So I think there's a lot of applications that we could, that we could work within.
Mm-hmm. So, and for those people, just to kind of paint a picture in sort of people's minds in terms of how they might sort of start interacting with this thing. Am I right in thinking that it'll be something similar to, if anyone's used a web, some kind of like the EchoSim sort of website or any website like that, where it'll allow you to kind of speak to it. Essentially, it's kind of like a little microphone in the address bar. Is that how it works, or is the microphone?
Yeah, it could be. One of the great things about our platform is it's really flexible. We're really just powering the entire experience. You can create and put however you want to interact with that voice AI. You can do that in any way you want from a design perspective. You could put it in the search bar. You could have it only on certain pages. You could put it in your regular taskbar, wherever and whenever you might want to display it. It's possible, but so it's super flexible. And again, we allow, since we know all about your product catalog and your products and your and the data that goes along with all of those products, it increases accuracy, it increases speed, and it increases the ability for us to get super custom with your specific use case.
And obviously, this kind of thing is a incredibly new kind of thing. It's just starting to kind of surface around the internet. I mean, we've seen something the other week about Spotify trialing a little sort of microphone to let people interact with that via voice, and we've got kind of like Google now on the desktop have got the little microphone there, so you can use that to search. So it's kind of it's a really sort of new concept in terms of being able to interact with a web browser through voice, and also apps on mobiles and things like that. And I'm wondering whether, kind of from your experience so far, whether you've seen any patterns emerge design-wise in terms of where to place the icon, how to get people onboarded in terms of using these features. Have you got anything that you've found works particularly best to get people starting to use this kind of voice interaction in an environment where typically they'll be just looking and clicking?
Yeah, I think that's ultimately going to be the, finding those solutions is ultimately going to be the thing that sparks adoption of this. I think where Google and Alexa and a little bit in terms of Siri, as they came out specifically with the speakers, and it's a kind of a singular interaction with just your voice. It's not multimodal. It's not with voice and visual. I think that, just using those two products, I think, taking them out of the box and using them was pretty intuitive. But I think where you kind of get the letdown is when it doesn't do something that you assume it's going to do. And so I think one of the good things that they've done is they're on top of getting, and both of them do this, they're on top of kind of getting you communications in front of you, very often about new things that you can say to Alexa or new things that you can say to Google Home. And it just kind of plants ideas in your mind. And those things are very kind of, broad as well. Speaking about, the Echo and the Google Home itself, you can do a lot of different types of things with that. I think a lot of the companies that we've started to work with and talked with, they're very kind of focused use cases. So they're more focused on maybe shopping for a specific thing, and shopping in and of itself has its own patterns that are kind of followed. But to be honest with you, we've experimented with, placement of that stuff, and even placement of the icon, but even talking with companies, they all have different needs. Like some of them look at it as a very search specific thing. Some of them look at it as more of a site wide thing. So I think, how you're applying it depends on really what you're trying to get out of it. If you're really only trying to augment your search experience with it, it would make sense to put it in the search bar. If you're really trying to make it become a quote unquote assistant across your entire website. So, if you need support or something like that, or you're looking for products, or you just want to navigate to a page, you would need to figure out somewhere to put that icon that's kind of global and is easily accessible from anywhere. And then there's obviously ergonomical things to think about. with the icon as we've kind of tested some different placements, bottom right, bottom left, top right, you know what I mean? Where there's, where you have to reach for something that you're also trying to speak into at the same time, it can get a little bit clumsy. So I think there's still some, on the mobile, especially on the mobile space, I think there's still some understanding and testing to go to do to kind of really understand how people are going to use that stuff. And then at the end of the day, like I said, I think it's just necessary to place it where it becomes most useful or helpful for your user. So I think just obviously keeping that in mind. So I wouldn't necessarily say I've identified any patterns as far as like UI placement with the mobiles, with the mobile stuff, just because it just hasn't become a thing yet. I think Spotify, I was using it the other day, it only shows up on the search screen, and it's in the bottom right and you can tap it. Alexa on the Amazon app is, up near the search bar in the top right-hand corner. So I don't necessarily know. It's not like the hamburger menu that appears in the top left or the top right, and it's this kind of established thing yet. And again, I think it'll be based on, what you're really trying to do with the application. I could eventually see there being apps that don't necessarily have a traditional graphical, interface. It could just be a voice button that you're pressing. So it might be more front and center than something now where you're just trying to introduce it to users in a way that is, basically a feature that's helping to augment your existing experience.
So you mentioned in there about, some apps may become the equivalent of essentially just a kind of voice interaction where, they might just have a sort of like an icon to enable the voice thing front and center. I mean, in sort of like almost like replacing what is now the equivalent of like a search bar sort of thing.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it could be a thing where, it's just you're using your voice to navigate around content. There isn't a need to have a structured navigation menu or something like that. It might just be an app that's doing things for you based on what you're asking it to do. I think we're a little bit away from that, but at the same time, I think if you look at interfaces, over time, like they evolve like that to make it so that things become, some things become extinct, some things become more front and center, and so and then again, what the app is actually really trying to do.
Cool. So that's the sort of Voysis platform, if you like, and what it does and how it kind of works and things. What's then? Can you tell the listeners a little bit about what your role is within Voysis and kind of what's gone into the whole sort of voice user experience side of it?
Yeah, I think kind of joining the company, it was something where I looked at it and I had taken some time off to kind of figure out what I wanted to do next. And so, long story short, I, was referred through a colleague that actually works here now as well. And I've always been the type of person that's interested in kind of the newest things. I really like to figure things out. Like I said, I'm a tinkerer, a builder, and I felt voice was a really new, fresh opportunity to kind of apply what I've learned in my career to date and kind of how to approach new challenges. So I felt like that was a good jumping off point for me. So kind of what this role, I think, from my perspective is, and what's kind of involved in it is it's a little bit of everything. It's a little bit of work, prototyping things, testing things. So coming up with, ways that we can display the interface or use the interface or overlay the interface, and then testing those ideas, experimenting with that kind of stuff. And then also, there's kind of a consultant angle as well with new customers as they start to ask questions about design and how to approach integrating the design into their applications. And so that's kind of my role right now, which is, being somebody that loves to tinker and experiment, is a fun thing to kind of take on, is just kind of working on prototypes and learning about, how people may interact with those things going forward.
Cool. I mean, we kind of touched on sort of one of those challenges there in terms of going forward, figuring out how to get users to be more comfortable with these kind of things in environments where traditionally it's kind of like eyes and fingers or whatever. What are some of the other sort of challenges that you've had to overcome, or research problems that you've had to figure out since you've sort of started there at Voysis working on this really sort of, it's a really new kind of technology and a really new sort of interface? What are some of the challenges that you've sort of faced since you started?
Yeah, I think one of the things as a designer, I think I maybe wrote this in that blog post, but just understanding what the technology is capable of. Everybody talks about AI and voice, and we just assume like, oh, it's magic. It's you can do anything with it, and I think that one of the biggest hurdles is really understanding what the capabilities are and what the limitations are with the technology itself. I think once you kind of get a grasp on that, it helps you to kind of think in a little more context about what's possible right now. That's not to say things won't be possible in the future, but I think that was, kind of an initial hurdle for me to get over, is to really understand what the technology is and how it works. From a, when designing voice interfaces, I think one of the things is obviously paying attention to the type of voice interface you're designing. So if you're doing a multimodal voice interface where you have a graphical interface to help augment that experience, is kind of it's very different than kind of designing for a voice-only experience, or like a zero UI experience where you don't have a graphical interface to help kind of guide the user. So I think that approaching those two different things is a very different animal, and that was something that I wasn't kind of accounting for when I first joined. But seeing how using Alexa and using Google Home, seeing how that differs from being able to talk to an app and then see specific things coming back to you when you say something, as opposed to completely conversational where it's a back and forth conversation, basically.
And do you think the user behavior is sort of like different in those two environments, sort of thing? Like if people are kind of interacting with something that is predominantly graphical with a voice kind of element to it. I don't know whether or not you've kind of noticed, or if there's been any research that you've been doing, or whether you can kind of theorize on it, but would people's type of interactions with those two modalities be different in terms of when someone's interacting with Alexa versus when they're interacting with, for example, an e-commerce website? Is there anything that might be different about how a user might behave in those two sort of environments, do you think?
Yeah, I think again, I think where the voice, the zero UI experiences now, they're very kind of limited in what you can do. So buying a sneaker, so to speak, on Alexa is basically out of the question, unless you're kind of repurchasing a sneaker that you've ordered in the past or something like that. But there are certain things that you need to see, and I think that people. I don't know if they've built them up yet, but I think the indicators are that people understand that the Alexa and Google's of the assistants of the world are there to do a certain job for them, and then they have these other things that they go to in order to complete other jobs. And the metaphor I always use is sticking with the sneaker metaphor. I'm a sneaker guy, if you couldn't tell. Sticking with the sneaker metaphor, it's the difference between asking your assistant, if you have an assistant, and you say, "Hey, assistant, can you go buy me a new pair of running sneakers?" versus walking into a Nike store or an Adidas store and saying, "Hey, I'm looking for some running sneakers." That person at the Adidas store is going to ask you a bunch of questions and is going to have a bunch of knowledge about the inventory that they have. Whereas your assistant going to the sneaker store is not going to have all of that information. They're just going to go there and do the task that they've asked you to do. So that's kind of how I would explain the nuance between kind of the graphical interface helper as well as the Voysis kind of Voysis intelligence around brand specifics versus kind of the Alexa and the Google of the world that kind of is a very overarching assistant that is kind of doing, things that are kind of mundane or not mundane, but things that are more kind of singular. They're not getting super deep into understanding the content of a brand or a product catalog.
Yeah, and there's obviously some things as well, which, you mentioned the kind of shop assistant there who might be able to advise you on the running sneakers and look at your gait or whatever. But there's also some things that you just, especially if you're looking at trainers, there's an element of you just want something also that looks cool, and you can't really sort of you can't see that, can you, on voice only kind of zero UIs.
And I see, I think it's been interesting. We've talked to a couple of companies that do groceries, and I think that what's interesting about that is you could do that with a zero UI, but it also helps to get kind of I think one of the pieces of feedback is it's nice to get back a confirmation that you're talking about the right thing. So like you may recognize something from your pantry that you normally get, some sort of soup or beans or something like that from your pantry that you normally get. When you're saying it to a voice assistant, they're saying the brand name and the name of the thing back to you, but there's no visual kind of communication back that, that's the one that I have in my pantry that I wanted to get a new version of. Whereas, when you have a graphical interface and you have the ability to surface that product and then show that exact thing, oh yeah, that's the exact can that I wanted, or that's the exact package that I wanted. I think it just helps. And maybe that's just a product of the fact that we're, potentially weaning ourselves off of that, the way that we currently search and shop for products. But I think, I think real life is a good example of all of this, where, you walk into a grocery store, you see everything. You know what I mean? It's not like you're standing outside the grocery store on the phone telling the guy inside, hey, get this for me. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think that it's a good metaphor that, people are visual people, and I think that's where having the multimodal experience is really beneficial.
Yeah.
In those types of things.
Yeah, that makes a huge amount of sense. That, yeah. So you were talking just then about sort of at the beginning of this piece, you were looking at when you kind of started at Voysis, and you were sort of looking at some of the limitations of the tech. In sort of like the Voysis world and the work that you're doing with clients, and then your sort of aspirations for the future. Because what I'll do is I'll in the show notes I'll link to a really interesting podcast with Peter Cahill, who is the CEO of Voysis. It's called the AI in Industry podcast, and he discusses a little bit about how the AI works in the background and how it all kind of hangs together, and how you then go about indexing people's product catalog and stuff like that. And you've spoke, Brian, about how kind of sophisticated you can get with your searches. So rather than having to click on your filters and your sidebars, you can just say, show me some, I don't know, black Nike trainers under £100, size 8 or whatever.
Sure.
So that it sounds to me, I mean, I haven't tried a website that's using the Voysis product yet, but it sounds as though it's performing pretty well in terms of being able to drill down into the searches. But then, what are some of either the limitations that you're referring to earlier on, or some of the things that in the future you would like Voysis to be able to do to enhance that kind of shopping experience?
Yeah, and again, to caveat it, I'm not saying that it's limited. Just understanding the technology of kind of artificial intelligence and speech and how speech technology works. It isn't magic. And I think as we've kind of uncover more things to use it for, we're certainly innovating, and we've innovated on a number of things to kind of satisfy new things that are coming up in the market, and I think in the future voice the technology is going to evolve. We're in the very early stages of this, and it's going to evolve and evolve and evolve. So I wouldn't say that there's limitations. There is probably now, and there are limitations, walking into a new company blind and just assuming that there's magic going on. But yeah, so I think to kind of, I think in the future, there are boundless ways that people are going to use voice. I think you're already seeing it with, autonomous vehicles are going to get there eventually. The IoT space, I think, is going to be huge. So I think that there's, just as when the IoT space kind of blew up 3 or 4 years ago, there was a lot of different, it was really interesting to see how things that you would never think needed to be internet enabled became internet enabled. And then all of a sudden, like, wow, that really makes sense. These thermostats, and then the information that they can give you and all that kind of stuff. So I think voice is on a similar trajectory there, where it's, I think it'll start to get incorporated into things that we've never even thought of before. I was a child of the 80s, not to date myself anymore, but, I grew up watching stuff on television and in movies that seemed unattainable back then. Shows like Knight Rider, where he talked to his car and his car did stuff for him, and he, Back to the Future 2, where you use your thumbprint to kind of do everything. The original Michael Keaton Batman, where he'd talk to his Batmobile and turn shields on and off and make it come find him. That was all crazy stuff going on back then that seemed completely unattainable, and here we are on the precipice of all of this stuff happening, I think. And so I think that as the need evolves, platforms like ours are going to evolve with it to adapt and make things even more awesome. So.
And now all we need is a car that not only is voice enabled, but it'll also send us hurling into the future as soon as we reach 88 miles an hour.
Exactly.
Fantastic. So you're one of the people who has made the transition from the kind of graphical UX sort of design space and graphical design space over into the voice world. And I think that over the next certainly 3 years, I reckon that there's going to be a hell of a lot more people doing the same sort of thing. And we're kind of already seeing that with things like, the Alexa skills, that, there's something like 30,000 skills in the Alexa sort of skill store. And there's more and more UX sort of designers who have had their ears pricked by the voice space and who might be interested in making a bit of a pivot and transitioning into this kind of space. And you've wrote sort of a really interesting article on this, and I'll link to that as well in the show notes. But I'm wondering whether we can cover a little bit of it here for those who are listening. So you're kind of talking about some of the similarities from transitioning between graphical sort of design and voice design, and we'll kind of talk about the similarities and differences in a second. But just in terms of sort of from your perspective, what's it been like for you sort of transitioning from the graphical side of things to the voice sort of side of things? What's the whole sort of experience been like, and what are some of the things that you've noticed?
Sure. So, I think I mentioned earlier, I've been fortunate to span a very kind of interesting part of history and technology growth, I think. And, I think in the article, I likened it to, when, mobile apps became a big thing. Like, you were a web designer in the mid 2000s, and then mobile apps became a thing, and, people transitioned into designing for applications, which was a variant or a very different kind of approach to for companies to do. So I think that kind of making that transition from being a web designer to being a mobile designer or a mobile app designer was a very similar type of jump, where you're changing form factors. There's new limitations with screen size, with tapping, but there's also new opportunities with, gestures and those types of things. And so I would liken this transition for me to being a very similar experience to that, where I think if you're the type of person that likes to solve problems and you like to figure things out, which most good designers are, I think it's a great opportunity to kind of get in to this next thing, this voice thing. and I think, just kind of doing your research, consuming as much as you can, about what's out there. And I think you even mentioned this in the article, but using the stuff that's out there to see what it's about, and things that work for you and things that don't work for you, and watching your friends and family do the same things. I watch my kids use Siri constantly. Like, you ask them what Google is, and they're like, why do I have to Google stuff? Like, why can't I just say it to Siri? So it's a very different mindset. And I think watching different types of people, which is something that you should be doing with, in traditional product and UX design, watching people interact with these things, will help to open your eyes. But I think, you asked about similarities, in kind of visual UX design versus voice UX design. And I always go back to, my approach really hasn't changed. I take a very kind of scientific approach to things, to my design work. And, most of the time it's always going to start out with establishing what the problem is, what a hypothesis might be, and some experiments to run, and then running those experiments and learning from that, and, and iterating on it. So I think that approach definitely still applies, because really, at the end of the day, what you're really doing is trying to help your users get something accomplished, right? So it's, being user-centric is about, making your user the star and making them feel good and making them feel comfortable. And I think at the end of the day, that mindset is still part of the main focus of what you're trying to do. And then I think the last thing is, designing apps. Designing apps and websites is really if you think about it, is really kind of having a conversation, with guiding people down a path, or helping them find the information that they're looking for, and letting them know if they've made a wrong turn or made an error or done something that is great, or something like that. So there is a dialogue there, but I think the similarity is in the fact that there's a dialogue where I think it's important in a graphical interface to understand what the error states are and what the points of delight are, where you can kind of congratulate the user on things. And I think the same goes with these conversational kind of natural voice interfaces, where there is still a dialogue with the thing that you're interacting with. So I think there's a similarity there, where you kind of have to design for that dialogue.
And so what then is some of the differences, if there's some UX designers listening to this who are kind of, let's say for example there's a UX designer and they are going to be starting a new job next month as a voice user experience designer. What's some of the first things that will strike them as being different about working in the voice space versus working in the graphical kind of space?
Yeah, so there's a few things that I kind of stick in my mind about that. And one is something that I mentioned earlier, which is, understanding the interface that you're designing for. So if you're designing for a zero UI versus a multimodal UI, I think you have to understand that those are kind of two different animals. And so I think, just being understanding and delineating between the two, and what might work best or not work best for your users, is obviously a thing that needs to be decided. I think the biggest thing for me is designing for variable inputs and outputs. So if you think about kind of graphical interfaces, they're very rigid. If you really think about it, there's this architecture that's exposed to the user, whether that's an app or whether that's a website. There's an architecture that's exposed, that you're basically navigating through an architecture of information. And I think that with voice design, there definitely still needs to, an architecture still needs to exist. You need to kind of, create good data, so to speak. But I think with designing for voice, there are those variable inputs and outputs. So, somebody can say anything to the system. Whereas in a graphical interface, you kind of go down a path. There's labels on things. There's a clear way to get to the next thing. So I think that understanding, the conversational nature of voice interfaces, where there can be variable things that the user is giving you, and then variable things that you're giving them back. It's a very different thing. Like out the window goes, traditional IA documents and kind of architecture documents. And I think it's more about, designing in that conversation. And I think, ultimately that's how voice is going to become great, is when all of these types of things are somehow cataloged all together, so that there's a really good smart thing. And we at Voysis are trying to do that, where we are collecting data on a daily basis about how people are asking for things, or how they're expecting the system to reply. So I think that's really important to understand, and that's one of those things that to delineate. It's not about kind of traditional site mapping and wireframing anymore, so to speak, but it's more about the conversation. And then the last thing that I've kind of run across in my experience has been user testing itself. So it's one thing to have kind of paper prototypes or very lo-fi prototypes for an app. It's one thing to build some click-through things in InVision or in Sketch or whatever your choice is, and have some users click through that stuff. I think with voice, there's that added element of audio, where testing that is a very kind of it's been a tricky thing for me to kind of get to a really great way to do that. So the user testing is going to, is something that will definitely change in how you test your experiments. Will be very different than how you would test a graphical interface.
Yeah. And have you had to sort of like, with that, have you had to sort of like create, like some sort of Wizard of Oz kind of testing, or would you have a mock-up website where you would index stuff? Or
we've done it a couple of ways. We have a couple of demos that we've put together that we use to test, and that helps us to understand, again, actually having the tangible thing in your hand and using it helps you really to understand about a lot of the ergonomic interactions, but also the things that people are saying. So I think ultimately the ideal thing is having that, but we've also tried to do a really lo-fi study where I think it was for asking for groceries or something like that, where we just built a PowerPoint deck with a bunch of items on different pages, and then asked them, how would you ask somebody for this? You know what I mean? So it was kind of like a like a Rorschach test, where you just put that the item out, and then you ask them to put their conversation in context and kind of understand how they would naturally go about doing that. And I think I read somewhere, maybe it was Cortana, they were talking about how Cortana, they were trying to, their part of their research was going out and actually following around, actual executive assistants because they wanted to understand about how a really good assistant would function. Wow. And so I think there are a lot of kind of lo-fi ways that you can figure it out. I just feel like it's a bit different than a lot of the traditional UX testing methods that are out there.
Yeah, absolutely. Fantastic. Well, before we wrap up then, Brian, quick last final question. What's your favorite pair of sneakers?
I'm a huge Air Jordan guy.
Nice.
So hence my 80s upbringing, but Air Jordan 3s are my favorite.
Yeah.
The white ones with the cement.
Nice. My favorite pair in the 90s, which is now I think probably still my favorite pair, is the Air Max BWs.
Yeah, those are good.
Yeah. I got a denim pair of those
style.
a few months back. Yeah, I'm liking them. Or the Zeros. I'm fond of my yellow Zeros. They are.
There you go.
Yeah. Classic. So where can people then, Brian, find out a little bit more about Voysis if they wanted to kind of explore the product and what you do a little bit more?
Yeah, so you can find us obviously at voysis.com, just VOYSIS.com. And we're on Twitter as well, at Voysis. So hit us up there.
Cool. What about yourself? You obviously you do quite a lot of writing. You obviously know your stuff. What if people wanted to kind of, check out what you've been up to and sort of get some more sort of insights from yourself? Where could people sort of follow you?
Yeah, so our blog is obviously a good spot for that. LinkedIn, I'm on, and I dabble in Twitter a little bit. I'm not a huge tweeter, so but at Colcord is my Twitter handle.
Cool. Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for joining us, Brian. Really, really appreciate that.
No worries.
That was Brian Colcord of Voysis. Thank you so much, Brian, for joining us. That was an immensely interesting episode. We covered a hell of a lot more ground than I thought we would, actually, and there was bags of insights in there for VUI designers, VUX designers, and UX people who are looking to transition or interested in the transition from graphical user interface design or UX into the sort of voice world. There's loads of insights in there from Brian. Super smart guy, super clever guy. I'll link to the Voysis blog and the posts that we were talking about from Brian. There's a few really interesting ones in there. One's called Designing for Voice Interfaces, and one is called You're Already a Voice Designer, You Just Don't Know It Yet. And that's talking about some of the similarities that we've been discussing between, the differences, the similarities between the UX side and the VUX side. Do check Voysis out if you're a brand that has either an e-commerce site or a site that's looking to enable some kind of voice interaction, or even an app that's looking to enable some sort of voice interaction. Do give them a shout, check them out. I'll link to the AI and Industry podcast as well, with the Voysis CEO, and that gets into sort of detail, the Peter Cahill, that gets into detail about how all the back end hangs together and stuff like that, if you want to learn a little bit more about that. And yeah, thank you so much to Brian for joining us. Thank you all for listening, and until next time, see you later.